I just want to see that you wrote both.
I'll request our guests to join us on the dais. Mr. Arun Jaitley, Honorable Finance Minister, Honorable Mr. Justice Nariman, the author, Mr. K.K. Lahiri, and Mr. We have all gathered here today to release the book of Eastern Book Company's publication, Interstate River Water Disputes, Genesis, Evolution and Analysis, authored by Mr. K.K. Lahiri. Let me start today's function about the efforts taken by the author for almost 3 decades in writing this book with an Urdu couplet. सींचा है इसे खून से हम तिश्ना लबों ने, सींचा है इसे खून से हम तिश्ना लबों ने, तब जाकर इस अंदाज का मैखाना बना है. I now have a very pleasant duty to perform by welcoming the dignitaries sitting on the dais with bouquets. I will request Mr. Surinder Malik to present a bouquet to our chief guest, Mr. Arun Jaitley. May I now request Mrs. Brinda Bhandari, advocate and daughter-in-law of Mr. and Mrs. Lahiri, to present a bouquet to our special guest, Honorable Mr. Justice Nariman. May I request Mr. Abhinandan Malik to present a bouquet to the author, Mr. K.K. Lahiri. May I request Mr. Karan Lahiri, advocate, to present a bouquet to Mr. Sumit Malik, associate editor of SCC. This book is dedicated to Mr. Vinod Bobde, senior advocate, who has not been able to join us today. I will request the author to present a bouquet to Mrs. Ranjana Bobde, who has joined us this evening. I request the author to do it. I will now request Mr. Sumit Malik to give his welcome address.
It is indeed my privilege to welcome Mr. Arun Jaitley, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Honorable Justice Rohinton Nariman, Judge Supreme Court, author of the book, Mr. Lahiri, Advocate Supreme Court, members of Mr. Lahiri's family, Professor Jaitley, Karan, Brinda, sitting and former judges of the Supreme Court, sitting and former judges of the Delhi High Court, distinguished senior advocates, senior and other members of the EBC family, to this book release of Interstate Water Disputes Act. Even though they need no introduction, Mr. Jaitley has had an illustrious career both in law and politics. But what I'm given to understand is that politics is his first love. When in jail during the emergency, he learned to read and write Urdu in the Ambala jail. During Prime Ministership of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, he served the Commerce and Industry Minister and the Law and Justice Minister. Now he serves as the Finance Minister and the Information and Broadcasting Minister. He's argued many important cases before the Supreme Court and various high courts. What few people may know of him is his penchant for food and that he's a tremendous foodie and quite a connoisseur. His favorite cuisine being Amritsari. Many more details on his life as an advocate and politician are set to be revealed in a forthcoming book to be published by ABC. He's also very kindly written the foreword to another book, India Business Opportunity, which is under printing and expected to be released soon. Justice Nariman is amongst the youngest advocates to be designated as senior by the Supreme Court and has admirably served at the bar for many years. On his elevation to the Supreme Court, again placing him amongst a select few advocates to have been directly elevated to the Supreme Court, he has been delivering extremely erudite judgments. His enunciation of the law in Shia Singhal is a locus classicus. So far, we've seen many a great judgment rationalizing and harmonizing seemingly inconsistent precedents with a clear statement of law emerging. We look forward to many more such judgments, sir. Justice Nariman is a voracious reader and an aficionado of Western classical music, and his interests go well beyond the law and include Buddhist literature and scriptures. I am told he takes his walks very seriously and would walk from Shimla to Wildflower Hall and back a good 30 kilometers without losing a breath. Mr. Lahiri is a fourth-generation lawyer, though the first to settle in Delhi. He is an alumnus of the prestigious Doon School and St. Stephen's College. He studied law at the Campus Law Center and has been practicing law for the past 35 years. His practice has been varied, though specialized in the area of water disputes. His first love, though, remains arbitration, both domestic and international. This is his first book, though I sincerely hope not his last. It has been a wonderful past few weeks, interacting with Mr. Lahiri, finalizing the book cover, and going over him with the little details to bring what you will see before you, the book in its final shape. He has been truly a wonderful learning experience for me and I. We look forward to working with him on a few things that we've discussed. When we first received a proposal that Mr. Lahiri wanted to publish on interstate water disputes, the first thought was, why this act? Would there be a market for it? Is it too niche? But then we found that there are only a few compilations of essays in the area of water disputes. And this gap in legal literature needed to be filled. And when we finally received the manuscript, no doubts remained that this book needed to be published. Mr. Lahiri has done such an amazing job of analyzing the law under this act. He has brought to the fore all his years of practice in this area, and what you have before you will truly be the most authoritative work and commentary on the Interstate Water Dispute Act. It has been our endeavor at Eastern Book Company since its inception in 1942 to serve the bench and bar and assist in nation building by publishing authentic and accurate material which helps preserve and further the rule of law. This work, that is the Interstate Water Disputes Act, comes in line with EBC's publishing of books like V.N. Shukla's Constitution of India in 1950, and taking this list today to over 500 titles. The or of the Supreme Court cases or the SEC online products, whose database has over 2.7 million documents and material from the Incorporated Council of Law Reporting, London, Singapore Academy of Law, Singapore, Hein Online, US. And our ebooks, which have recently been launched on the iOS platform and are to be launched on the Android platform. The EBC Explorer, which is a website with many additional resources to the book that we publish, we aim to be at the forefront of legal publishing, and with our team of legally qualified persons and our technology and sales team to ensure that high quality products reach the lawyers, the judiciary, and the legal fraternity. So once again, welcome all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. I will now request our chief guest and our special guest to release the book. Before I request Mr. Arun Jaitley, our chief guest, to address the gathering, I wish to quote from Maya Angelou, which is apt for our chief guest. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. May I now welcome our chief guest to address this gathering.
Justice Rohinton, Nariman, Mr. Lahiri, Mr. Malik, ladies and gentlemen. At the very outset, let me say how delighted I am to associate with this book being written and published by Kishore. It's a coincidence that both Rohinton and Kishore, I have had the privilege of knowing them before they became lawyers. In fact, I met Rohinton first when he was probably a 17-year-old. Both Ryan and I were in college and he was a fresh entrant into the college, somewhat younger than us. And I have seen him grow from position to position, and certainly from one level of brilliance to another. I met Kishore when he joined Praveen Parikh's office as a student intern. Those days the custom of student interns was almost very rare, but he was one of the few who did that. Though I had heard of him when he was a student for some other colorful activities, which he swore me never to disclose. But as I saw him grow over the years, and I'm sure he has specially acknowledged some people in his book. He's acknowledged Kapil for having introduced him to this subject of interstate water disputes since 1994. When the Ravi Byas dispute was able to speak, it still continues. And then, of course, Vinod Bobde, who couldn't make it today. In fact, I think it was extremely gracious of Kishore to dedicate this book to Vinod, who most people who had the privilege of knowing Vinod over the years certainly have all the best things to say about him. The chief opinion maker in that regard being Rohinton himself, who's always had very nice things to say about Vinod. And I'm glad Kishore has dedicated this book to his close friend Vinod. One thing I realized about Kishore from his very initial days, that he was obsessed about his work. So if he had a case to work on, he didn't believe in doing it within minutes or hours. He spent his time on reading, he spent his time thoroughly on drafting, he went into every aspect. So I asked him just now how long it took him to write this book, and he said 10 years. But that's typically Kishore Lahiri, because he chooses his work, he's very thorough on his work, and he works on every aspect of this work. And I think since he lives in a very academic environment at home, that must have enabled him to become an author, because Nainjot had always those traits ever since her young days. Karan, I have known him almost since the day he was born, and remarkably bright, and I think he's a future author. The daughter-in-law Brinda, a Rhodes Scholar, and has all the potential besides being a lawyer to grow into a legal academic. She's already involved in some very serious research work that she does for various organizations, and I think eventually that will become her first love rather than just being in courtrooms itself. So I always tell Kishore that there was an imminent danger of his being the only Lahiri who hasn't written a book. So he said he couldn't accept that, and therefore for the last 10 years he'd been struggling and working on this subject, which finally has seen the light of the day. I've had read parts of this book and glanced through most of it. He's actually dealt with a very difficult subject. Difficult because water issues are not really legal issues. They have to be resolved legally, the interstate water issues. But they are extremely sensitive. And therefore, once you initiate these water disputes, it's almost like the bifurcation of states that takes place. It's easy to talk about it in terms of election agendas, but when you get to implementing them, I think they raise serious economic concerns, which then translate into political and emotional concerns. And nobody is willing to let go of water. In fact, it's almost the lifeline of our economy. The Ganga itself impacts the economy of 40% of India's population. And at times what appears to be, to mostly lawyers here, only legal disputes pending in courts, may eventually end up impacting the lives of millions and millions of people. I remember in the decade of the 90s, the Narmada Dam issue was pending in court, and it went over for a reasonable period of time. The cost overrun itself was because of the pendency of the Supreme Court proceedings into thousands of crores. And once it was permitted, it changed the economy of a large part of Madhya Pradesh. It ended the dry region of Kutch. It took that state to a double-digit agricultural growth. It ended the power problem, because if you remember in the 90s and the early part of the 2000s, there was a serious power crisis consequentially. So what appeared to some of us lawyers as just one case pending in court, which took decades to resolve, it ended up impacting the lives of people in different parts of the state itself. States, though not on a national basis, which within themselves have succeeded in even different kinds of irrigation programs. Some states like tried the minor irrigation programs, and some tried transporting water from one part to another. And both these, actually amongst various economic investment, the fastest returns always come by irrigation. If you build a great infrastructure for industry, the investment will come in, the industries will come in, the corridors will come in. and before they start giving employment to people, it will be a matter of years, if not a decade or so. But irrigation is one area which almost the next season gives you economic results. And therefore, by transporting water from one part of the state to the other in the Malwa region of Madhya Pradesh, the agricultural growth of the state went up in given years from 18, 20 and 22%. In the last 15 odd years, the irrigation initiatives in Andhra Pradesh have actually shown result. And recently they spent a matter of 3 to 4 months before Krishna and Godavari could be linked together. And that is going to impact some parts of the state, and the Polavaram project which they have will impact on other parts of the state. The disputes really arises when the riparian states are not willing to let go of the resource and share that resource with the non-riparian states. And the additional concern is that if there has to be a fair distribution, the tribunals and judgments can go by settled principles and have that fair distribution. But then implementing those orders, I think, is far more difficult than the drafting of the orders itself. And therefore, at the end of the day, we'll need to use our entire resource. And once we are able to give a comfort level to the agrarian community, that its economic interest is not going to be impacted, its attachment to water is almost as strong as its attachment to the land. And I'm glad Kishore therefore chapter-wise the historical evolution of the problem, the issues that stand and a vision for the future. He's dissected the problem and then written a book which covers with the sound legal principles on which some of these issues itself can be resolved. The book also has a compilation of all laws and regulations which deal with the subject, and it's very rare that in a jurisprudence of this kind, which is very rare, somebody acquires an expertise. I personally feel that you probably require a permanent tribunal rather than a tribunal which meets off and on separate for each water dispute. So you probably will require in a country like India one tribunal which deals with all these disputes, so that there is a certain amount of expertise that the members of the tribunal also acquire. Hopefully Kishore's book will be a great addition to any library, and I wish him all the best, and probably the next case that Kapil refers to him probably will see a book 10 years thereafter. All the best.
Before I call our special guest, Honorable Mr. Justice R.F. Nariman, I must voice the grievance of the advocate on record community with the Supreme Court Collegium, which elevated him to become a judge of the Supreme Court of India. It was a great loss for us because we never used to make any briefing note when he was briefed as a senior advocate, and our only job in the conferences was to answer some pointed questions, and the counsel was fully ready to argue the matter before the Supreme Court. May I now request our special guest, Honorable Mr. Justice R.F. Nariman, Judge, Supreme Court of India, to address this august gathering.
My dear friends, Arun, Kishore, Mr. Malik, my revered parents, and dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, I must confess that I am the only Nariman who has not written a book yet. The more prolific of the two, by the way, is my mother, not my father. can't help thinking that when one comes across great river water systems, that not only do they provide us with what all life basically requires, but they are actually cradles of civilization. I wonder how many of you have visited Rome, and if you have visited Rome, how many of you have seen Bernini's great sculpture of 1651? It is a sculpture of 4 great rivers representing 4 great continents. In 1651, Australia was not yet discovered. We begin, interestingly enough, with the great Mother Ganga. And Mother Ganga is typified by the sculptor with not only a human face, because Neptune, don't forget, was the god of water in the Roman pantheon, but with a massive oar, showing that it was a river water system which for years has been used by mankind to ferry men and goods up and down. Following the Ganga, we have another sculpture of the great Nile, which housed the great Egyptian civilization. Here, interestingly enough, we have the god Neptune with his head covered. Now it is covered because at that point of time, the source of the Nile had not yet been discovered. So it is a river system which was so massive that one could not predicate where exactly its source was. The third river, of course, is the great river of Europe, the Danube. And along with the Danube, you have the then pontiff, who was Innocent X, his particular coat of arms, to show that it's the river closest to the papacy. And the fourth river, interestingly enough, was the river Plate. So to always wonder, why did he choose the river Plate? That is answered because not only is the Plate in South America and nowhere near the other great river systems in the north, but apparently he chose it because he put silver coins next to it. Because at that point of time, he thought this is a place where you could go and find El Dorado. Don't ever forget, the river Plate is interesting for another reason. When World War II began, in December 1939, one of the first engagements of the World War was the Battle of the River Plate. How does it affect India? There were 3 British cruisers that stood outside Montevideo Harbour to dog the German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee. One of them was the HMS Achilles, which after the war became our flagship and became the INS Delhi. And apparently that INS Delhi has now been disbanded, and you find some parts of it in the yacht club in India. But coming back to the great river systems and coming back to Keshavar's outstanding book, why do I say it's outstanding? Obviously, he's put an enormous amount of thought into it. In the very first chapter, he describes water in Roman law terms, which is very interesting. He calls it res communis and res nullius. Now, these concepts show that even if you try and hold water in the palm of your hand, it slips out. What he has then traced is our Government of India Act, Constitution, etc., all of which continue this Roman law concept to show that ultimately it is user alone of this great national resource which can be controlled or regulated. It cannot be owned. What also tickled me in one sense was the fact that Keshavar's reading was not confined to river water systems at all. I found that each chapter was headed with a quotation from very, very diverse sources. For example, and I want to read each one of them to you. The very first chapter, which deals with water, is from a quotation by Albert Georgi. Now, as most of you know, Albert Georgi won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1937, having discovered vitamin C, which was crucial not only for most of us, but crucial for sailors particularly, because that alone cured scurvy. Apart from many other things that this great man did, he donated the entire prize money for the benefit of Finland, which had suffered at that point of time, thanks to Nazi occupation. Now, Georgi has a quote which says, "Water, the hub of life. Water is life's mater and matrix, mother and medium. There is no life without water." Similarly, he begins chapter 2 with a quote from Genesis, the Bible itself. The quote goes this way: "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God said, 'Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place. And let the dry land appear,' and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good." Beautiful. I would exhort those of you who haven't read Genesis to now go and please read it. Chapter 38 in particular is a little known chapter, which deals with a very interesting story of a man called Judah, who gave his name to an entire nation, and how ultimately it was with, of course he turned a widower, and his daughter-in-law Tamar equally was a widow twice over, because both his sons who married her died, and he promised her to the third son. Didn't keep his promise. Ultimately, there is a very piquant point in the book where he actually goes into Tamar, who is now dressed as a prostitute, he doesn't know. And then as father-in-law produces a pair of twins. One of the twins is called Perez, after the great Shimon Peres, which we've all heard of. And it is from Perez that apparently Jesus Christ himself is descended in the direct line of descent. This leaves Genesis, and we come now to chapter 3, where once again Kishore's reading is extremely wide. Who does he quote? He quotes the then Secretary of State for India, John Morley. As you know, the Minto-Morley reforms of 1909 led for the first time to self-governing provinces in India. It also led to separate electorates for the Muslims for the first time. Legislative powers were enlarged, and the very first Indian, a man called Satyendra Sinha, was appointed for the first time to the Viceroy's Governing Council. Now, from John Morley, who later became first Viscount Morley of Blackburn, the quote is, "Evolution is not a force but a process, not a cause but a law." The fourth chapter, which is the present, has a very interesting quote again from a little known author. He is not to be confused with a clergyman of the same name who lived a little before him. But he was a physician in the time of George I, Thomas Fuller. He had a compendium called Nomologia, which he published in 1732. And interestingly enough, one of these aphorisms, because there are a number of them which I want to read to you, Kishore has picked up. The aphorism here is, "We never know the worth of water till the well is dry." Fuller was also very famous for statements like the following: "Beware of telling an improbable truth." Now, all lawyers beware. Get the facts, or the facts will get you. And when you get them right, or they will get you wrong. All things are difficult before they are easy. And fourth, Bacchus, that is the god of wine, hath drowned more men than Neptune, the god of water. This brings to mind Justice Krishna immediately, because Justice Krishna had both Bacchus as well as Neptune in two separate judgments. Bacchus first, P.N. Kaushal versus the Union of India. There is a sentence describing drunkards thus, if I remember right. They take reeling, rolling trips in the realms of the Jocos, Beliocos, Lacrimos, and Comatos. And now Neptune. Neptune is again dealt with in the great Samsher Singh judgment, where he speaks of the Westminster model and where he says in his inimitable language that it is not the Potomac, Washington, but the Thames, London, which has fertilized the Yamuna, which is Delhi, in order to produce the Westminster model. Now, with this, we come to the last chapter. And here again, Kishore quotes from Coleridge, the famous ancient mariner, which all of you must have either read or done in school, done in college, whatever. And it's the famous water, water everywhere. And all the bogs did shriek, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Apart from the book itself, which is a great study, these little clues tell us something about the author. And I was very gladdened to see that the author's depth and width of reading have also somehow or the other enlivened these pages. Before I end, I must give my dearest friend Vinod Bobde, to whom this book is dedicated, a very, very fond, I won't call it remembrance, because even though he is not with us physically, he is with us otherwise. Vinod and I go back to our, at least my early days of practice when I came here in 1986. At that point of time, both of us shared in common two extremely interesting persons as godfathers. One was the late Balmukund Agarwal, and the other was the late Justice A.P. Sen. Balmukund Agarwal was perhaps the best read man I have come across in my life. I remember his taking me around his library for the first time, and I picked up some book by Stefan Zweig, with which I was reasonably familiar, The Tide of Fortune. And I remember just asking him, when did you buy this? So he noted it by date. After which he began telling me about the book in great detail, one after the other. I remember the first story dealt with the head upon the rostrum, which was Cicero's death. The second was the fall of Byzantium. He related all these two, one after the other. And I realized then what a great bibliophile this man was. Unfortunately, I didn't know him long enough, but we got very close before he died. And both his sons have given me his entire library. They've given it to me. And I hope that when I retire at the age of 65, I will sit down and systematically devour as many of those books as I can. Justice A.P. Sen, again, was a father figure to both Vinod and myself in court. I remember I had come to court because I had nothing really to do. And Vinod was involved in some litigation between landlord and tenant which had come from Allahabad. And Justice Sen was hearing it. The facts ran something like this. Vinod appeared for the tenant. There was some old bungalow with a lot of land around it. and the tenant had been evicted down the line. But what was also pointed out was that none of the landlord's children, the landlord was dead by then, ever came to the bungalow except to visit it during their vacations. So Vinod had suggested some halfway house which the other side had accepted. Justice A.P. Sen saw me sitting in court, called me to the front and appointed me amicus curiae only in order to look up the law under Article 136, which law ought to tell the judge that whatever the two may say between themselves, it doesn't bind the judge. So I went, looked up what I could over the weekend. The judge had also warned me, and I still remember, he said, don't forget to see page 80 of that SLP. Because at that page, the tenant is described as a political bigwig. So he thought there was some arm twisting involved here. On the Tuesday which followed, we all came to court. I came armed with several authorities. And most unfortunately for Justice Sen, the first question he asked me was, what do you think of the compromise? So being young and inexperienced, I blurted out and said, I think it's completely fair. He said, oh, you think it's fair? So almost like, why did I appoint you, you idiot? So I immediately tried to backtrack at that point and said, yes, but I've also looked up the law. The moment he said, or he saw that I thought it was fair, look at his discipline. He thought it was most unfair. He immediately dictated an order thanking me for being amicus, said that the amicus thinks it's fair, and therefore the compromise should be taken on record. The second incident which involved Vinod and myself, which comes to light, there are so many, was Vinod's extreme brilliance as a lawyer and an advocate. Here again, there was a judgment of the late Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee on some water cess. And it came before a three-judge bench headed by Justice Kuldeep Singh, who, as you know, wasn't one of our more patient judges. And I got up and I said, I think this judgment is right, I don't know why it's been referred. And the municipal corporation was then represented by Bhimrao Nayak, who got up and tried to show the judge that it was wrong. He got to argue for about 20 minutes or so, didn't make any headway. And just as the judge was about to dismiss it, Vinod got up. So he asked Vinod, who are you appearing for? So he said, I am also for the corporation. So he said, you know that one advocate has... He said, of course I know. And I must tell you, Vinod is one of the most disciplined advocates. But he said, I feel a little strongly in this case, so I just want to tell you something which I don't think has been pointed out. And I won't take more than a minute. Now, Vinod, with his grace, was able to get a judge like Justice Kuldeep Singh to listen to him, equally graceful. In the first minute, I realized that there was going to be trouble. In the second minute, I realized that my number was up. And in the third minute, yes, Mr. Nariman, and I couldn't answer. And that judgment got reversed. This is Vinod's brilliance. He did it in virtually 5 sentences, wrapped the entire thing up. Having gone down memory lane and seeing my very dear friends on the dais and other dear friends sitting here, I can only tell you that this book will fill a great void in our legal literature. And I exhort all of you to buy it and read it. Quite apart from the lovely quotes, it is truly a masterpiece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nariman, for such a brilliant address. Though we were slated to have the closing remarks and vote of thanks by Mr. Lahiri, the author, but we have tinkered with the format. Instead of closing remarks, Mr. Sumit Malik will put a few questions to the author, Mr. K.K. Lahiri, on the lines of In Conversation with the Author. Thereafter, Mr. Lahiri will give his vote of thanks to our guests. Mr. Subhi.
Mr. Lahiri, considering that your primary passion is arbitration, how is it that you wrote a book on interstate water disputes?
So let me begin by forewarning you. The author full of the book is not what the audience wants, so I'm going to be very brief in my answers. I hope that's okay. Actually, interesting question you put to me, Smith. This is a question which many a colleague has asked me after they got the invite for this book release. And really there are two reasons for it. One is a matter of timing. I really got involved with interstate water disputes about a decade and a half earlier than arbitration. Kapil put me on the interstate river water disputes in the Ravibias tribunal. Arbitration, I really got into the nitty-gritty about the late 90s after liberalization and after the new act came in 96. So one was the question of timing. The other was the question of need. If you look at arbitration, you more than anybody else will know, there is a plethora of literature on legal literature on arbitration. Whether commentaries under the old Act of 1940, new Act of 1996, English Act, International Commercial Arbitration. But here for 60 years, from 1956 till date, we had no commentary, no comprehensive commentary on the interstate water disputes. Yes, AIR manual had some things. Volume 29.2 of Osbury's Laws of India has something, but that's just not enough. So really these were the two reasons, and the second was the more important reason.
And what would you consider to be the USP of your book, and how is it structured? And where do you think this heading in the future?
Well, there's three questions in one, so we'll wrap it up with this. I'll try to be as brief as possible. USP, well, in spite of sounding like I'm blowing my own trumpet, probably the first comprehensive commentary on this act and the rules dealing with it section by section. That is the USP. And this is in chapter 4, that is the core of the book. And that is really what the book is about. Right. As far as the structure of the book and where water disputes are headed, I've dealt with the third part of your question in chapter 5, which is captured in the future. But as far as the structure is concerned, I've summarized it in my preface. The first chapter, because Rohinton dealt with, Justice Nariman dealt with some of the quotes before the chapters. The first chapter deals with water, that is flowing or running water, proprietary or other rights in such water since Roman times. Then I have gone to the English law on the subject, then dealt with Indian law. This chapter actually was not an original part of the book. This Vinod got me to add, because he felt it was a little incomplete unless I added the chapter. Chapter 2 is titled Genesis, and that is where the quote which just Nariman read was from the Genesis. This covers the period from 1935 to 1950, that is from the enactment of the Government of India Act 1935 to the adoption of the Constitution of India. I'm sort of using my preface as a refresher. So. This chapter is titled Genesis, gesturing towards the origin of the current framework, because my stand is what I posit is that the Act of 56 originated from the Government of India Act 1935, then to the draft Constitution, then leading to Article 262, under which this Act was legislated. The third chapter is captioned Evolution, and therefore again what Justice Nariman read was that quote on evolution. Here I deal with the evolution of the 1956 Act from its enactment in 56, through the various amendments of 57, 68, 80, 86, 2002, and the framing of the rules in 1959. The fourth chapter, which I call the core of the book, is the present. Here I've analyzed the book. The fifth chapter answers your question on the future. Here I've talked about recommending greater central control. Mr. Jaitley was talking about it, premised on water being a national resource and an asset for the country as a whole. I've asked for greater central control and intervention going hand in hand with state cooperation and depoliticization of water disputes. It becomes an election issue. And I have made an impassioned plea that let this not become a, sort of vote bank political issue. I've also asked for judicial restraint in matters of water disputes. And again, what Mr. Jaitley touched upon is setting up of a permanent water disputes tribunal. Here I've had the temerity to disagree with our living legend, Mr. F.S. Nariman, and the Punchi Commission, who both advocated scrapping of the Act and conferring this jurisdiction on the Supreme Court under Article 131. I have differed with both of them and said, please don't burden and overburden Supreme Court. We dump everything on the court system. They are immensely overworked. I mean, somewhere we must have pity, so I have advocated exactly what Mr. Jaitley was saying, a permanent water disputes tribunal. And I have dealt with great lengths on suggested amendments to the Act and the rules. And this probably may be of interest to the Honourable Minister, because being an ex officio member of Niti Aayog is currently tasked with drawing up amendments to the Act and the rules. I think they started work last October, November. And those in the Water Resources Division of Niti Aayog may find about 25 pages in Chapter 5 very relevant. So this answers all your 3 questions. And I think we should limit the questions to that, and with your permission and Mr. Makbul's permission, if I can thank all those present here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed privileged and honored to have friends like Arun and Rohinton, who in spite of their enormous successes in life have remained as humble and rooted as they were since we became friends almost 4 decades ago. They have never been too busy for friends, and that's how they are here with us this evening, in spite of the enormous pressures of their time. My heartfelt thanks to the Honourable Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, for sparing his time to be with us this evening and for his delightful address. Thank you so much, Arun. My heartfelt thanks to Honourable Mr. Justice Rohinton Nariman for not only sparing his time to be with us this evening and for his wonderful address, but also for having taken out the time to go over my manuscript. The manuscript form was 600-700 pages. Rohinton said, just leave it with me. And within 3 days, he wrote the foreword. To go over my manuscript and write a most generous and effusive foreword. I don't know whether this book will go on to become a locus classicus on the subject, as you say, Rohinton, but it's really the thought and your faith in me that counts. Thank you ever so much. I'm grateful to Mr. Sumit Malik and Eastern Book Company for accepting my manuscript and publishing this book. Sumit and his editorial team have been exemplary in carefully and painstakingly going through the editing process to ensure that the book meets with international standards. Thank you, Sumit and Eastern Book Company. My heartfelt thanks to Vinod's wife Ranjana, his son Arjun, daughter-in-law, and the Bobde family for being here. It would have been wonderful if Vinod could have been here, but one understands. My heartfelt thanks to the Honourable Judges of the Supreme Court and High Court, both serving and retired, who've taken out time from their hectic schedules to be here with us this evening. Justice Siddharth Midul, Justice Sudarshan Mishra, Justice Rajiv Sahai Endlo, Justice Brijesh Kumar, Justice Vikramjit Sen had to leave, Justice Ananga Patnaik, Justice Mukul Mudgil, Justice P.K. Bahari, Justice Anil Kumar. I may have missed out on names because of everybody sitting here. I'm also delighted to have 2 of my gurus with us this evening, my senior Kapil Sibal and my law teacher, Professor Mulchand Sharma. Thank you, Kapil and Professor Sharma. My heartfelt thanks also to my esteemed senior colleagues, my contemporaries and my junior colleagues who are with us here this evening. Thank you all, especially to stalwarts like Mr. F.S. Nariman, Mr. Ashok Desai, Mr. P.P. Rao, Attorney General Mukul Mudgil, Mr. Mukul Rohtaki, Solicitor General Ranjit Kumar, Mr. K.T.S. Tulsi, Mr. S.S. Javli, Raju Ramachandran, Rupinder Suri. Also a big thank you to all my friends from school and college and other walks of life who, in spite of not being lawyers, are here today for the release of this book. Thank you all. I am particularly delighted to see celebrated historian and author Ram Guha, my senior in school and college, who has made it all the way from Bangalore. Thank you, Ram. Thank you so much. My heartfelt thanks to my family for being here today in strength, especially my mother-in-law who made it in spite of all odds, Thank you, Mama. And lastly, a big thank you to you, Ajaz, for emceeing this entire evening. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen.
Let me add to the vote of thanks of Mr. Lahiri and conclude the proceedings by thanking our chief guest, our special guest, and all of you here for being with us this evening. We would be grateful if you stayed on for some refreshments and further interactions. Thank you.
नितिन फोन किया था
outside.
Drinks time when Sunny showed up.